Well, clearly, in many countries in the Middle East, including Iraq and Syria, the smaller components of society, so ethnic or religious minorities, for example, are at particular risk when societies become more violent, particularly if that violence is fractured. There are different armed groups operating, there are different groups contending for power in the state. It is those communities which are not armed, which have no protectors, which are not large enough themselves to exercise power, who become very, very vulnerable. And we've seen that certainly in both Iraq and Syria. And I think we need to remember that it is not just a problem in the Middle East. This is a problem faced right around the world. One of the features of societies, including in Europe and North America, over the last 10 years has been an increase in polarization, an increase in hate speech against particular religious groups, particular ethnic groups, this form of xenophobia that has risen, largely sparked by the migration crisis, but also actively encouraged by politicians. And these are all warning signs about future violations. We need to listen to them. Well, just to take Iraq as an example, we have seen some historic communities, and when I say historic, I mean communities who have been part of the ethnic and social fabric of the lands we now call Iraq for millennia, for 2,000, in some cases for 4,000 or 5,000 years, are now in the process of being eradicated from the country. So the Sabaean Mandaeans, the community has been, it's reduced in size by well over 3/4. The Christian community, I mean, many Christians fled the country after the revolution, after the Ba'ath Party came to power. What we saw in 2003 is that after the invasion of Iraq, many of the Christian community started to leave, and it's probably now about a third or a quarter of the size it was back in 2003. Well, the Yazidi community was always probably the poorest among Iraq's major communities, inhabiting mainly the north of Iraq in the Nineveh Plain and the Sinjar, around the Sinjar Mountains. They have been subjected to campaigns of persecution over many repeated cycles in Iraqi history. Yazidi historians actually talk about the 100 genocides, and they list multiple occasions when their communities suffered violent persecution. They were subject to the campaigns of so-called Arabization under Saddam, when they were forced, some communities were forced to identify as Arabs, some were forcibly relocated from their villages. And then, of course, following the removal of Saddam Hussein, we've seen the community subjected to different waves of attacks. Probably the largest single atrocity that ever took place in Iraq was a double truck bombing that took place about 10 years ago that targeted the Yazidis. And of course, in 2014, in the advance by ISIS, by so-called Islamic State, the Yazidis were yet again subjected to a genocide when thousands were killed and thousands of Yazidi women were enslaved.